So I think it's safe to say that the Nintendo Switch with the Tegra X2 equipped has punched well above its weight. Seeing games like Doom and Wolfenstein running on that system, pretty eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people. Even third-party games like NBA 2K, whether you like it or not because of the microtransactions, if you take a look at it, it's pretty much the same game across the board there, despite the Switch being a portable handheld system. So when we heard about the possibility of a Switch revision, originally it was a lot of speculation. Technically it's still a lot of speculation now. And it seems that now that the Wall Street Journal has reported on their site that there is a Switch revision in the works and that we should be seeing it next year in 2019, possibly as early as the summertime, which we'll talk a bit more about that as well. It really exploded with a lot of speculation, a lot of interest online. So I figured we'd finally talk a bit about it, and I kind of want to get into what Nintendo and Nvidia can do here to revise the Switch and which way they could be going with it and the way I think they'll probably be going with it. So we're going to go through all of that. I do want to point out right away that this is absolutely speculation. Here's the thing. Nothing could happen next year. There is a lot of talk, of course, before the Wall Street Journal about a revision with speculation in 2019. And some of that had to do with the new consoles possibly dropping in 2020 with the PS5 and the Xbox 2. However, the link between those it's still not as concrete because Nintendo likes to kind of do their own thing and go their own way. So I want to point that out. That is a possibility that nothing could happen, and that is what we'll start with. That's the baseline right now. Just nothing happens and the Switch just goes on, and maybe Nintendo looks down the road a few years even to where the Switch 2 would come out instead and just forget about a refresh of some kind. Now, that's not typical for Nintendo with the DS Lite coming out like a year and a half after the original DS came out. We've seen the Game Boy go to the Game Boy SP, but the big thing really was something like the 3DS XL going to the new 3DS XL, where they actually had games that were specific to that system, because originally you didn't have that, but the new 3DS XL has, games like Xenoblade and Minecraft and The Binding of Isaac, all specific to that model system. So let's actually move up and say that they do a revision, and it's mostly what the Wall Street Journal has talked about, which is a new screen. Maybe because in the background we've had some of these screens shift around anyway, where they were working with JDI, and then they had some other companies come in, and they've kind of shifted around anyway. But with what Wall Street Journal was saying, it sounded more like it was going to be a different screen for maybe saving battery power. Just the amount of power that it draws could be lessened, and that could be a possibility, but that would be a very small upgrade, and it would almost not be worth really doing unless battery life was their main focus. They could kind of do a few things here. They could change the form factor of the Switch, possibly adding a larger battery and a screen that is more energy efficient. That's a definite possibility to have a new Nintendo Switch, or a Switch Lite, as you could say, maybe with a slightly brighter screen. The screen has actually changed throughout, though. If you look at a screen, for example, in the newer one that I picked up as opposed to my older one, I didn't notice the screen looks different. It has like a different tint to it almost. It's weird, to be honest, looking at it. So they have changed screen manufacturers, but it would almost be like they would go to a newer type of LCD maybe. It sounds like OLED is out of the question. Yeah, obviously the cost of that would probably make that a bit more expensive for consumers. So it doesn't even make sense really to go to OLED with that for what you're doing on the system when it comes to just playing games, not really watching movies or anything on it, at least not right now. So let's say that happens. Maybe we get a refresh where it's a little different in terms of form factor. Still has to stay pretty much the same height and everything, since the Joy-Con controllers have to slide onto it. But maybe it gets slightly thinner or something. Although again, the thickness is kind of dictated by those Joy-Con controllers. All right, so let's say they want to go in, they want to change up the chipset. Maybe Nvidia and Nintendo come together and they're like, let's step up to the next thing. Let's make the system a bit more capable, as we're seeing what developers are able to do now with the X1 and the Switch. What if we move it up, give the developers a little more horsepower, a little more room to stretch their legs, and let's see what they can do with that. Now, I personally think they have to keep the games backwards compatible, as in the games have to, I think, work across both generations. I don't even think there should be an option to be honest. I think it should just work. Like, Nintendo should mandate that it just works across, much like how Sony has done with the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, and Microsoft has done with the Xbox One and the Xbox One X. All the games, they just work across the board. You don't have to worry about it. The base Xbox One that was what? Like 1.5 teraflops all the way up to the 6 teraflop X. All the games work across the board. I think it has to be the same way with the Switch. So with that in mind, it would pretty much have to stay with Nvidia, right, with their Tegra lineup. And they have some that they can use, but for the most part, I think either way, they're going to customize the chip at some point. They customized the X1, despite it being stock with its clock speeds, and they actually added an extra gigabyte of RAM compared to probably what they were originally going to go with, was going to be an X1 stock with 3 gigabytes of RAM. We heard Capcom kind of poke them a bit and said, hey, we need a little more RAM. So instead of going with something that we've seen with, say, the Google Pixel C, or we had the Nvidia Shield TV, which had an X1 and 3 gigabytes of RAM. Instead of that configuration, it sounds like they added an extra gigabyte and went forward with 4. So I do think they will customize in some way, and I think the most likely scenario is they will go up to the Tegra X2. And originally I was thinking about it and I said, I don't think we really haven't had any consumer level products with the X2. We had the Jetson TX2, which is a developer board, right? We've talked about that before. You can actually order it from Nvidia and play around with it, but it's something that's plugged into the wall with 2 different power modes where it has like performance and efficiency. But interestingly enough, a device that I did not think would make the X2 a consumer level product is a thing that made the X2 a consumer level product, and that's the Magic Leap 1. I can't believe it, because I, like many other people, didn't even think this was real or was going to come out, but it's actually out there. People on YouTube have reviewed the thing and talked about it. It's like a mixed reality headset, but it is powered by a Tegra X2 with the Denver cores and everything. So the X2, I guess, is ready. Because originally we talked about how the X2 wasn't ready at the time when the Switch came out. There were no consumer level products, all development boards. But here we are now with a device that does run on battery, that's in a small form factor. It's part of the augmented reality, the mixed reality headset and everything. So the X2 sounds like it's ready for production. Now, what would the X2 do exactly? Well, it's more efficient, so they could raise the clock speeds more than likely if they're okay with the battery life as it is now, and it does double the memory bandwidth, so picture your games like Doom, where that can drop to a fairly low resolution on your screen. It's very noticeable in Wolfenstein, like when you're looking at the NPCs and you see like the faces and stuff, whether it's in a real-time cutscene. It's pretty noticeable that, yeah, it runs at a fairly low resolution. Well, because these games do dynamically scale their resolution with something like an X2, you would have that resolution rather than drop down to something like 540p, possibly stay at just like 720p at all times, possibly even going up to 1080p, or if you play like Mario Odyssey, that I believe sits at like 900p and then can play around with it as it needs to, that would be something that would probably stay at the roof the entire time. They could even come out with patches that would raise the resolution with the new Switch system, so the game would be backwards compatible between both generations of the Switch, if you want to call it a refresh or a generation, and the resolution would just change. So I don't even think it would matter if they brought over a game, right, that was very low resolution on the old one, because you're making the choice to get the old Switch and play the old Switch, so you probably don't care, whereas somebody who wants, 900p or 1080p at all times, they would not have a problem paying the extra money and getting the Switch that's equipped with an X2 with twice the memory bandwidth. I assume they would probably double the RAM, just to be honest. It can do 8 gigabytes of RAM, so why not? You have some overhead, probably with the pricing that will be probably $100 more than the current Switch. Now, they could go a different way with the X2. They could keep the clock speeds the same. They'll still get the benefit of double the bandwidth, and they'll probably get quite a bit more battery life out of it with the efficiency of the X2. So that would be interesting, but that could also make some people pretty frustrated if it comes out and it's really just a jump when it comes to the battery life. Although some people might be happy with it, but I do think there are a lot of people out there that would be annoyed with them equipping the Switch Pro or Mini or new Switch with a more powerful, more capable chip, and then hamstringing it with lower clock speeds just for that battery life. I think I would be frustrated even by it. All right, so let's say Nvidia and Nintendo, they're like, let's just get crazy with this thing. Let's release a Switch that's capable of 1080p. You can play Resident Evil on it, everything. You know, it doesn't matter. We're just gonna release a chipset that is capable and is even more powerful than the baseline Xbox One in some cases, and just more capable in general. Let's move up to Xavier. This is a chipset that I don't think is ever going to find its way into a consumer level product that runs off of a battery. I think it's clear when they first showed it, it was set up for their automotive line. It was set up for self-driving cars. It pulls a lot of power with how it is now with the 30-watt TDP, so I don't think this is going to be dropped into a Switch. They could pull some of the technology, though, and customize a chip heavily. That's the thing. I expect this to be a 16 nanometer Pascal chip because that's just what Nvidia is doing now. That's what all their new cards do. Why would they continue to produce heavily anyway a 20 nanometer X1? There's a good chance that they just had a lot of X1s laying around and they sold them cheap to Nintendo. But now the Switch is a success. You can take a chance. So let's say they just go big and they just customize this chip like crazy. So Xavier brought a lot to the table. It brought, again, more memory bandwidth. It's so much higher than the X1 with what it is now. 1080p would be no sweat. It would just roll right through that without any issue. But then we get back to the cost. Adding things like 512 CUDA cores, it gets kind of expensive. That's double the amount that's in the X1 and even the X2, whereas the X2 is more of a, let's double the bandwidth for memory and make this more efficient, whether it's for cooling, battery life, or just higher clock speeds. Xavier just went crazy on this thing, so it would be a bit more expensive. This would be a $400 to $450 product, especially when you roll in the factor that there are going to be Joy-Con controllers coming with it, a dock. This wouldn't be cheap. Now, I really talked in depth about the Tegra line of chips in a history of the Tegra. It was an older video I did, but I will leave a link to that in the description if you want to check that out. I think it's good to see that and really see the specs right in front of you for all these things, so you can see all the generational leaps that they've done with the Tegra, but have not implemented them into consumer level products. These were originally developed for consumer level products, and they kind of moved them over to automotive stuff where they're doing self-driving cars, and now it seems like they're moving them back to consumer level products with the X2 now in an augmented reality headset. So why not? The X2 seems to make a lot of sense for the Switch. I think it has a good cost benefit because I don't think it would be that much more expensive. It might even be easier to put those through manufacturing line since they're already doing 16 nanometer chips. Seems like they're producing it at this point for the Magic Leap 1. So they could play around with the clock speeds. They could do things like turn off those Denver cores and make sure there's full backwards compatibility between all of them with the A57s. So it makes sense. That is what I'm going to go with. I think if they're going to change the chip out at all, they'll customize an X2 to what they need, and that's how they'll do it. Because I think if they go up too far, you're basically releasing a brand new system, and I do think it would be weird to have just segment your entire fan base and your user base by saying, hey, these games are only coming out on this system. I don't think it's smart, and I don't think it's something Nintendo actually wants to do. But let me know what you guys think down below. I'm going to go with the Switch. What are we going to call this thing? Nintendo would call it something like the new Nintendo Switch, right? That's what they would do. But that would be a weird thing. I think you'd go with I guess you'd go with Switch Pro, or that seems a little too easy. Maybe it's hard to figure it out with Nintendo. But we'll just say the new Nintendo Switch, a Tegra X2, 8 gigabytes of RAM. They're going to keep 32 gigabytes of memory. I don't know what to tell you guys. They're going to do that because that's the easiest way to save money on it. And let's say it comes out holiday 2019 and it's $350. The current Switch will either stay at $300 or drop to $250. I think this will be $350 though, and it'll be out there for people who want better resolution, better frame rates in those dynamically scaling games, but the games will work across the board. Let me know what you guys think about that down below. Make sure you like the video if you liked it, guys. Dislike it if not, and I'll see you in the next video.